Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I'm Susan. On October 8th, 2016, at approximately 11:30 p.m., the defendant, Stephen Bourgoin, walked out of his home, got into his pickup truck, and headed towards Richmond. At Richmond, he got on to I-89 going south in the right direction. But then he slams on his brakes, backs his pickup truck up, and turns his truck around, heading north in the southbound passing lane, the wrong way. That's when the 911 calls start coming in. There's a truck going the wrong way on 89. He's flying. I hope he doesn't hurt someone. The defendant stayed in the passing lane for over 2.2 miles. And as he sped north the wrong way, there was a VW Jetta coming south on 89 in the travel lane, carrying 5 young people. The crash reconstructionists will tell you that at 4.8 seconds prior to the defendant crashing his truck into that Jetta, he was traveling at 79 miles per hour, no brakes being applied, and he's in the passing lane. At 2.3 seconds prior to impact, he increases his speed to 87 miles per hour, no brakes being applied, but now he's steering left into the path of travel of the Jetta. At 1.8 seconds prior to impact, he's still traveling at 87 miles per hour, no brakes being applied, still steering left. At 1.3 seconds prior to impact, he has now started to apply his brakes, and he decreases his speed to 84 miles per hour. But now he's steering right, going back towards the passing lane from which he had come. The impact between the two vehicles occurred right near the center line of I-89. At the time of impact, the defendant was going 76 miles per hour. The Jetta had slowed down to under 33 miles per hour. The force of the impact was so strong that it pushed the Jetta back up 89 and into a median where it flipped over and killed Mary Harris, 16 years old, Cyrus Zhao, 16 years old, Liam Hale, 16 years old, Janie Kazi, 15 years old, and Eli Brookins, 16 years old. Mary Harris got ejected from the car before it burst into flames. There were others traveling southbound on 89 that night, and as they approached the crash scene, what they saw was horrific. There was debris in the roadway. There was a smashed truck sitting there, and there was a car on fire. Several of those travelers pulled to the side of the road, parked their vehicles, and got out to see if they could help. There were 2 medical personnel who ran down into the median. And right about that same time, Officer Eric Shepard from the Williston Police Department arrives on scene, and he jumps out of his cruiser and he goes down to the median. And as the medical personnel are trying to resuscitate Mary Harris, Officer Shepard is frantically trying to put out the fire, the Jetta, and trying to get the kids out. But he couldn't. So where was the defendant while all this was happening? Well, he had gotten out of his pickup truck and had walked down into the median to see what was going on. And when he came back up the median onto the interstate, he ran into a man named Keith Porter, another one of the people who had gotten out of their cars to try and help traffic control. And he says to Mr. Porter, "I don't know what happened. I must have lost control." But ladies and gentlemen, that's not the end of the story. The defendant sees the cruiser sitting there that Officer Shepard had jumped out of. The door was open, and he gets in the cruiser, and he takes off south down I-89, traveling at a regular rate of speed. But then he starts hearing radio traffic on the cruiser radio, and he sees police vehicles, and he slams on his brakes, backs up, and he turns the cruiser back north, going the wrong way again, heading towards the crash scene that he had just left. And as he's approaching the crash scene at over 100 miles an hour, the police are yelling, "Get off the interstate, get off the interstate." And people who were there on the scene were running to their cars, screaming. And the defendant took that cruiser and slammed it in to his pickup truck that had been sitting there. And the debris flew, and the debris and the cruiser hit several of those cars parked on the side of the road, causing damage. One car flipped on its side and causing injury. And then the cruiser burst into flames, and there were popping sounds going on, and the people became even more frightened. And some of them ran into the woods screaming, not knowing if they were going to live or die, not knowing if their loved ones on the interstate were dead or alive. The scene that night was like a war zone, and the witnesses are going to tell you that. People were walking around shell-shocked. So, where's the defendant while all this is happening? He got ejected from the cruiser, and the police officers dragged him away from the cruiser before it burst into flames. They handcuffed him and laid him on the ground. You will hear from a Dr. Vincent Garbatelli from New York, who was one of those people who were parked on the side of the road. He went to where the defendant was, asked if he could help, and he said to the defendant, "What is your name?" And the defendant said, "Stephen Bourgoin." And the doctor asked the police officers to please take his handcuffs off so he could take his blood pressure. And they did. And the defendant tried to run again. When the ambulance got there, the defendant was put into the back of the ambulance and taken to the hospital because he did receive some serious injuries as a result of these crashes. And you'll hear him yelling on the cruiser videos when they're played for you. He was arrested and charged with 5 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of aggravating operation of a motor vehicle without the owner's consent, and 1 count of gross negligent operation. And here we are. How could this have happened? Why would somebody do this? They'd have to be crazy, right? But that's not the question you're going to have to decide. You're going to have to decide whether the defendant was legally insane at the time. You've heard that he's raised the insanity defense, claiming that he was insane at the time that he committed these offenses, claiming that he had a mental disease or defect. And as a result of that mental disease or defect, he was unable to appreciate the criminality of his conduct, or he was unable to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen, as you're listening to all of the evidence. Think about what he did before, during, and after these crashes. In a few moments, I'm going to talk to you about the evidence the state intends to present for your consideration when you're thinking about whether the defendant was insane at the time, or whether there may be another explanation for why he did what he did. The defendant, when he puts on his case, he's going to call a Dr. David Rosmarin, a psychiatrist that they retained as an expert, who evaluated the defendant 16 months after the crash. Dr. Rosmarin will tell you that in his opinion, the defendant was insane at the time of the offenses. He will tell you that in his opinion, the defendant had been suffering from some sort of psychotic break or psychosis up to a week before the crash and up to 30 days after the crash. The defendant may also call Dr. Reena Kapoor, a psychiatrist who was originally retained by the state as an expert to review Dr. Rosmarin's findings and to evaluate the defendant, which she did 21 months after the crash. If she testifies, she will tell you that based on the information that she had, she agrees with some of Dr. Rosmarin's opinions, but disagrees with others. The defendant may also call Dr. Madeline Baranowski, a psychologist who Dr. Kapoor brought in to do a malingering assessment on the defendant. And if she testifies, you'll hear what her opinions were at the time that she evaluated the defendant, 25 months after the crash. The state is going to call as one of its experts Dr. Paul Cotton, a psychiatrist, who evaluated the defendant 5 weeks after the crash. Pursuant to a court order ordering the Department of Mental Health to assign a psychiatrist to evaluate the defendant, Dr. Cotton will tell you that in his opinion, the defendant was sane at the time of the offenses. The state is also going to call a number of medical doctors at the UVM Medical Center who saw the defendant days after the crash, October 13, 14, 15, 16. Dr. Suzanne Kennedy, a psychiatrist at UVM Medical Center, will tell you in her opinion when she saw the defendant, at the time she saw the defendant, he was not in any kind of psychotic break. Dr. Stephen Runyon, also a psychiatrist at the University Medical Center, will tell you when he saw the defendant, in his opinion, he was not in any kind of psychotic break. Dr. Roger Nackle, a rehabilitation doctor who saw the defendant several times during his hospitalization, will tell you this. He asked the defendant, "Do you remember anything about the crash?" Because he was trying to test to see if the defendant was suffering from amnesia. And the defendant said to him, "I remember it all, before, during, and after." But he wouldn't elaborate any further. You'll hear these medical experts testify. Please do not get distracted if the defense tries to focus on who called which doctor and retained them as an expert. Instead, please listen to all of their testimony. Listen to what they're basing their opinions on and decide who was in the best position to assess the defendant's mental state. So now, let's talk about the defendant and what his life was like prior to the crash. First, the defendant had been working at Lake Champlain Chocolates in the shipping department. His co-workers will tell you that right up until October 7, 2016, he was fully capable and able to perform his duties that required attention to detail and focus. But the co-workers and some of the defendant's friends are going to tell you he was very unhappy at Lake Champlain Chocolates. He couldn't get along with some of his co-workers. He didn't like how the business was being run. He had better ideas, but nobody really listened to him about those ideas. Most importantly, he was angry about the money that he was getting. It was not enough. There was no room for advancement. And to add insult to injury, one of the co-workers that he did not get along with, Luke Gauthier, had just gotten a promotion and a raise. The co-workers and his friends will tell you he was frustrated, unhappy, stressed out, about his work at Lake Champlain Chocolates. On October 7th, at lunchtime, he left for lunch with no intention of ever returning. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, he gets a call from his boss saying, "Where are you?" And he says, "I quit." He quit. No other job lined up. He quit. Second, you will hear testimony from several witnesses about the fact that the defendant was having severe financial hardships during the fall of 2016. He complained about it to a lot of people, couldn't pay his bills. Third, and most importantly, you will hear testimony about the custody battle the defendant was having with the mother of his child, Anila Lawrence. He wanted joint custody. He petitioned the court for joint custody. There was a hearing on September 26, 2018, 12 days before the crash. And the court said, "No, I'm going to give you 1 hour a week supervised visitation with your daughter on a Saturday from 10 to 11 a.m. at the place where she did her gymnastics." You'll hear that he was angry. You're going to hear testimony in this courtroom what the defendant does when he's angry, frustrated, stressed out, the lengths that he will go to when he's feeling that way. So where and what did the defendant do after he left Lake Champlain Chocolates on October 7th at around lunchtime? Well, he went and he had lunch with his friend Alan Kosovic at Five Guys restaurant. And Mr. Kosovic will tell you there wasn't really any difference in the defendant's behavior, just that he complained bitterly throughout the lunch about his finances, about the fact that he was being harassed at work, that he wanted to quit work. And he was complaining about Anila Lawrence, the mother of his child, taking advantage of him. Fast forward to the early morning hours of October 8th, 2016, 3 or 4 in the morning. The defendant decided he was going to go visit Alan Kosovic. He lived only a couple miles down the road from him. He gets to Mr. Kosovic's house and he says, "I'm looking for Anila." And he goes in and he starts pacing around and he continues to complain about the stresses in his life, the finances, how Anila was taking advantage of him. And then he left. Later that morning on October 8th, around 10 or 11 in the morning, he decides to go to the UVM Medical Center emergency department. He's checked in, he's seen, he's evaluated, and he's discharged. Please listen carefully to the testimony of the medical personnel who saw him that day. You will hear that the only complaints he made were about how stressed out he was about parenting issues and relationship issues. And he goes home. Saturday passes, and now we're back. It's 11:30 p.m. on October 8th, when the defendant walks out of his home in Williston, gets into his pickup, and heads towards Richmond. During the trial, you're going to hear from a lot of witnesses, lay witnesses, friends, neighbors, co-workers, family of Mr. Bourgoin, the defendant. You are going to hear from the 911 callers. You're going to hear medical experts. You're going to hear cell phone analysis experts, the crash reconstruction team experts, the medical examiner, the DNA expert. And you're going to hear from several of the victims of the second crash. I ask that you please listen to each and every one of their testimony, no matter who calls them in their case. The judge talked to you a little bit about what is going to happen in this trial, but I just want to touch on it in a moment. The state, of course, has to go first because we have a burden of proving each and every element beyond a reasonable doubt. At that point, The presumption is the defendant was sane at the time of the offenses. But then the burden shifts to the defendant to prove, by a preponderance of the evidence, that he was insane at the time of the offenses. And then the state then gets another chance to present evidence which it believes will rebut and refute that insanity defense. And as the court told you this morning, we will then have closing arguments, and my co-counsel, Ms. George, will be doing that. And she will be talking to you about how the state believes it has proven each and every element of the charges against the defendant. And she's going to be asking you to return verdicts of guilty on each one of those counts that the court talked to you about. Before I sit down, I just want to say something. One of the jury instructions you're going to hear is that when you are deliberating, you get to use your common sense and your life experience. And I ask you to remember that as you're listening to all the evidence that comes before you. On behalf of my co-counsel, Sarah George, and myself, I thank you so much for your attention.
So a brief recess.